Hey everybody. So I want to apologize on behalf of all the Americans that I know and am friends with to the rest of y'all in the rest of the world for the fact that I suspect that a lot of you are feeling like America's going a little bit crazy right now because of the president that we've got and the way that he's talking. And I'll just tell you that a lot of us are starting to feel that way. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I honestly don't know how much harmonica I'm going to play. So, please don't bother to comment and say, just go back to playing harmonica. Just go back to teaching me how to play the blues, but please don't ever share something that's on your heart about contemporary life. That would be kind of stupid, and I hope you won't be stupid that way. So I want to talk, I think people don't listen to each other enough, so I want to talk about the phrase, go back where you came from. And let me just say the prelude to this is that, so the President of the United States recently tweeted and then had a rally in which he told 4 U.S. congressmen that they should go back to where they came from. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, not congressmen, congresswomen, women of color, right? Because that's the way it's played on the news. But I want you to imagine that for the sake of argument, it wasn't congresswomen, that it wasn't women of color, although it happens to be those things. But just imagine that it was the U.S. president telling 4 white guys, 4 Jewish guys, maybe an Italian American or 2, go back where you came from, as a way of saying you don't belong in or to this country. Duly elected representatives of communities. When I was a kid, my grandfather, my Jewish immigrant grandfather, used to give me a silver dollar every year on my birthday. See that? 1904, this is. And America was a tough place in 1904. Who is that? Is that Lady Liberty? You'll tell me. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Out of many peoples, one. Out of many ideas of America and what it is and can be, one. Out of many races and genders and sexualities, this thing called the United States of America. And that's been important to people. Here on the back, of course, is an eagle, a symbol of liberty, freedom. In God we trust. I'm fine with that. I don't actually have a problem with that. United States of America, $1. My grandfather, my Russian, Lithuanian, Jewish immigrant grandfather. I'll read you in a minute from a book that he wrote. Most people who are immigrants to America don't have grandfathers who write books in which they tell their grandsons specifically. He inscribed it to me. Thanks for pestering me with all your questions. But let's go back and have a little history lesson. So William Bradford, remember the Plymouth Rock? Remember the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock? Remember coming over in, what was it, 1620, I think it was? Do you know why the Pilgrims, so these were English people they were Congregationalists who couldn't find freedom of expression, of religious expression in England. And so they went to, first they went to the Netherlands. You know why they left the Netherlands? They left the Netherlands because they were afraid their children were being corrupted by basically spring break in Amsterdam. I mean, not the pot smoking kind of thing, but they felt that their English-born children were going bad in Holland and were losing touch with their religion and partying too much. So they came to America. Turns out that I have relatives who came over on the Mayflower. Turns out that if you go back 21 generations, 17 generations, I have a chart that my aunt on my mother's side, my mother's sister, wrote that says I go back to Anne Bradstreet and Simon Bradstreet, Anne Dudley and Simon Bradstreet. So I got that in me. I'm a mutt. So what our president said to these women was, why don't you go back to the completely dysfunctional and horrendous countries that you came from? Because they were saying things that criticized America. You know, our right to criticize our country is like one of our God-given rights, according to our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But liberty means the liberty to speak your mind in public, freedom of assembly. So 4 congresspeople, our president told 4 congresspeople to go back where they came from. USA table tennis. USA table tennis. I was lucky enough in New York when I was there. Towards the end of my time there, I was lucky enough to have 4 table tennis coaches. Now, and I've been to the U.S. Open. Anybody who plays table tennis as an American, and I'm speaking to you and the rest of the world. America's not a table tennis power. To the extent that we are, it's because we have Asian immigrants, Chinese. Yi Yang Fan was a big guy. David Hernandez. I had 4 coaches, 5 coaches. George Braithwaite was an immigrant from Guyana who was there when I saw him in ping pong diplomacy. My Russian Jewish immigrant grandfather, who lived at Sutton Place South, took my father and me to table tennis diplomacy at the United Nations. And we saw George Braithwaite. Many years later, when I was in the Manhattan Table Tennis Club, George Braithwaite was one of my teachers. The chief from Guyana, immigrant, part of what makes America great. He was a fantastic guy. My next coach was Atanda Musa, Nigerian American immigrant. Fantastic table tennis player, part of what makes America great. Can you imagine how he must feel when he hears a president like ours say, why don't you go back to where you came from? I mean, that's just... My third coach was Renata Pelichova. So it was the United Nations. This is table tennis. This is my people, my culture. One of the many cultures in America is the culture of table tennis. It is a completely polyglot, internationalist, yes, Asian dominated, but also Caribbean and Dominican dominated. Not a whole lot, there's some white guys too. I was one of them, but it's more immigrant than not. And we're all one big happy family. And the Asians tend to kick butt. When I was at the U.S. Open, Fort Lauderdale in 2001, I lost to the best 10-year-old in the country, Andrew Lin, Chinese-American immigrant, good American. His whole family rooted him on. Kill the white guy. No, I'm joking. I am so glad that Andrew Lin kicked my butt and that his family cheered him on, and that I lost to the best 10-year-old in the country in the under 1100 division. I hope you get some sense of where I'm going, because I've grown up as an immigrant, a grandson of immigrants, great-great-grandson of immigrants. On my mother's side, my mother's mother was named Merle Joyce Fisher. I went back and took a look at her ancestry, and I've always known this, but so on both sides of her family, she was Orange City, Iowa, and they all ended up coming from the Netherlands. So it was Visser and other names I can't pronounce that eventually become Fisher, and that then she marries a Scotch-Irish guy named Dye. We're all immigrants at one point or another. It's about all we've got. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. And I don't know what it is about our current president that doesn't understand that. But he has made zero attempt, as far as I can tell, to summon up the collective will of our country as one thing. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating. It's frustrating for those of us who have worked in internationalist circles. I think about my other table tennis coach, Wally Green, African-American kid from Brooklyn. Wally, you can find him on YouTube. Wally, here's a shout out to Wally, who has quite a checkered background, I gather. He was articles you can find online about him having, guns, lots of guns when he was a kid. It turns out that our current president, really is of a time and a place when white folks in Queens, kind of Archie Bunker folks were feeling the pressure of white people were moving out, people of color were moving in. We've got a president who never really outgrew that. And it's sad. And it's sad. And I want to apologize to all of you around the world who may have had an idea of America as a kind of immigrant's paradise. I'm going to read you something, actually. I'm going to read you my grandfather's words. So one thing that amazes me, again, you can find this book. I'll encourage you to go and find Chaya Sonia, A Family's Odyssey Russian Style, the moving story of a family's odyssey toward survival. Don Gusso. For Adam. This is 1980. Here is the letter which I promised to write you following the many questions you asked me when you were 6. Questions about your heritage and whatever. I can't read that. Anyway. My grandfather grew up, he was the product of a mixed marriage between a 26, 28-year-old Russian Jewish guy who was a tailor in Minsk, or Kharkov, and a Lithuanian Jewish 14-year-old, believe it or not. My great-grandmother, his mother, was 14 when she kind of got it together. Product of that kind of old world marriage. But his mother was an incredibly brave woman. And when the Germans came in between around 1915 to the shtetl, the little Lithuanian Jewish shtetl in Pumpian, when the Germans came in, Russians were basically about to leave town. And the Russians banged on the door. We were inside the house, he says, on the ground floor with Gospodin Roskovsky, mother's employer, who seemed even more scared than we were. He was ashen, pale, all the shutters closed, doors locked. Mother was praying in silence. With the approach of night, again, this is my grandfather as a kid. He's a 10-year-old. Doors locked. Mother was praying in silence. With the approach of night, the shooting became louder. A bullet hit a window of our house. Get to the floor and under the beds, Mother whispered. We did as she told us. Under the beds we went. For a while it was quiet. Then we heard shooting again, running, shouting, falling. Then came a banging on our door. Don't get near the door, Mother whispered. Make no sound. But the banging persisted. Mother then crept over to the door and asked, Who is there? What do you want? Open the door. We are Russian soldiers. Open the door or we will break in. Leave us alone, she said. We are Americans. Amerikansky, Mother shouted back with authority. And they went away. He said God had heard Mother's prayers. The souls of her deceased relatives had interceded convincingly on her behalf. Mother praised God for coming to our aid. My great-grandmother, my paternal grandfather's mother, saved the family early in this 5-year immigrant odyssey by saying we are Amerikansky, we're Americans. She's a Jewish lady, this is ridiculous, overseas. And she says we're Americans. That's what America meant back then. That's what it meant to my grandfather. He talks at 5 years on the road, 5 years it took him. And finally they get close to New York. When word came, they're on a boat. They after all the, this is the immigrant experience. But again, most guys like me aren't lucky enough to have a book in which the grandfather gives you the play-by-play. When word came that we were approaching America, New York, and that within 48 hours, probably less, we would reach paradise, the passengers began to awaken as from a nightmare. It was as though we had passed from the dread of night into gleaming sunshine. While just about everyone in steerage had his or her own private vision of America, and especially New York City, where most were going, no one actually knew what to expect. There were few pessimists aboard. I listened to the conversations Mother had with some of our neighbors whom she had befriended. And what I heard went something like this, quote, after what we've gone through in Kishinev, especially with that terrible pogrom, no matter what we will find in America, it will be heaven. We should only get there. So they go on. In paradise, Mama, what are these brilliant lights and moving words doing in the sky? I asked in amazement. Paradise, heaven, my son, Mother answered. Enthralled, I continued to gaze through the porthole. Others had awakened and rushed to the porthole. Shouts of joy rang through the dormitory. As I continued to look through the porthole, I observed the mingling of the myriad of lights with the oncoming lighting of the sky from the rising sun, a scene so enchanting that it touched the very marrow of my bones. Then coming into view from the distance was the famous lady, the Statue of Liberty. Several men and women began to cry. It was morning, and we were in the harbor of New York. You know, I'm going to open the door. That was the immigrant experience. That's the experience that's deep in me. It's deep in my family. It's deep in my understanding of the world. Our current president not only doesn't seem to understand that, but he seems to want to do everything he can to poison the atmosphere in our country. So again, let me just, I'll play last little bit of music and end this thing. I just want to apologize to all my friends out there, not in America. You all get where I'm coming from. And if you don't, stick around. Maybe you'll learn something. But to those of you out there for whom America was an idea, the way that it was for my grandfather, the way it was for the Jewish folks who came over in 1920, who, by the way, came, the laws were tightened up in 1924. So I realized in retrospect, my grandfather got lucky. He didn't have the Ellis Island thing was pretty easy at that point. He wasn't one of those Jews during World War II who died in the concentration camps because America decided it didn't want to let too many Jews in. I want to apologize for our current president. Compassion has always been a part of America, and the ability to embrace the stranger, which has been a part of all great spiritual traditions. And my teaching of blues harmonica comes out of a desire to spread the gospel of that music, which is a melting pot of its own. If you've been following me for any period of time during the past 11 years when I've been on YouTube, you know that I'm not a hothead. There was a Bush satire video early on. There was a Trump song shortly after he was elected. But honestly, I'm kind of a liberal centrist in terms of politics. I am not a hothead. I don't like to use the word racism. I'm married to an African-American woman, but we don't throw that word around a lot. So that's not something that I'm going to say now. I'm just going to say that I'm intensely disappointed, that I had actually hoped for better from our president. I didn't vote for him, but I had hoped for better. Does that make sense? So I'll just finish by saying to my friends from overseas, I'd like you to do me a favor. I would love if you're willing to, comment on the video from the standpoint of what America means to you at its best. Where you're from, I'd like you to put where you're from so people will have a sense, because I have a sense that there's a world community. Some of you who are overseas may have visited America, some may have not, may have decided now you don't want to. Again, I want to apologize if that's where you are, but I don't blame you for that. Some of you may have relatives who are here and you may be worried about them. Again, I want to apologize. Most of us aren't like that. Most of us aren't the kinds of people who would make your relatives, if they're here, feel fearful. Most of us aren't. Most of us aren't. It's sad to know that some of us are, and that this sort of collection of feelings is not only being allowed by our president, but is being actively encouraged by our president. He is the duly elected leader of our country. He is my president. I wish he wasn't. I hope he won't be much longer. But I'm a patriot. America has given me so much. It's given my family, my parents, so much. I love the American land. I love American food. I love soul food and barbecue. I love Whole Foods. I love picking a tomato in the garden. I love chasing butterflies in the vacant lots. There's a lot I love about America, and most of all, I love the idea at its best. This is not American exceptionalism. This is the promise of America that has been so important to so many immigrant people for so long, dating back to the Mayflower. Remember, they were English people who didn't want to be corrupted by life in Holland. But Holland is where my mother's family came from. I got a lot of Dutch in me. Visser, Fisher. So I ain't putting down the Dutch. I love the Dutch. Love the Dutch. Love that skating thing you guys got going on. Okay, that's enough for me. I'll just end with show you some old American money. This is when 1904 was not a friendly time, but you know, you want to make America great again, Mr. President? E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. That's not an invitation to fascism. It's an invitation to diversity and tolerance. All right. See you guys soon with a blues harmonica lesson. How about it? Wait a minute. How about a lesson on how to flip a dollar over your fingers? Can't do it. Okay. Oh, there's one thing I completely forgot to tell you about. The photo. The photo, that's my grandfather and grandmother shaking hands with the President of the United States back in 1975, Gerald R. Ford. Imagine how proud my Lithuanian, Russian, Jewish immigrant grandfather and his first cousin, his darling Betty Gusso, imagine how proud he must have been to go to the White House and to meet Gerald Ford, President Ford, and to get that picture. Imagine how proud I am to know that, and I've never met a president, but to have a grandfather who had done something that was, he was a business magazine publisher,